Tonight, my presentation focuses on a story of spirituality, devotion, faith, and the restoration of a Frank Lloyd Wright design building. The main house here at Graycliff in Derby, New York, which before it became what it is now, a stunningly restored, publicly accessible landmark on the National Register of Historic Places, was a beloved home to many. A literal refuge, not only as a peaceful retreat for the Martin family for whom it was designed, but a sanctuary for those fleeing the Hungarian Revolution many years later. My story begins in the middle, not with Wright, but with the second owners of Graycliff, a group of Piarist Fathers, an order that is focused on the education of underprivileged youth. These fathers made Graycliff their home for nearly 50 years, by far the longest of Graycliff's 3 custodians. Here is their chapel, their main devotional space. They must have sensed the inherent spirituality Wright harnessed when they decided to purchase the property in 1950 after moving to Western New York to create an American province with the goal of providing children of parents who had escaped Soviet occupation an education in Hungarian and to keep their heritage alive. When the father's tenure began, the property became a celebrated centerpiece for Hungarian culture in Western New York, referred to as a mother house to the Hungarian community. Graycliff was originally designed in 1926 for Darwin D. Martin and his wife Isabel, who was the true client. They first summered on the property in 1928, with modifications continuing until 1931. It was Isabel who made this her true home, as she continued to summer on the property with her daughter Dorothy and her nuclear family for 8 years after Darwin's death, spending her last summer here in 1943. The property then remained vacant for over 7 years until the fathers arrived to breathe life back into it. Here is Darwin Foster Martin, Darwin D. and Isabel's grandson, Dari for short. He's in the exact same spot you saw in the image of the father's chapel that I showed a few slides back, on the south terrace that Wright designed as a space to confuse exterior with interior, among other things. The chapel was the first alterations the fathers made and was one of the first elements to be removed when the Graycliff Conservancy took ownership and began on the path of restoring the property, pictured here with restoration in progress. For those who have visited, you'll know that Graycliff's spaces have always been sacred. Though the fathers were likely the first to open that truly religious vein, Wright's design, as is important, as is characteristic, of most of his organic architecture, allows for a deep meditation on the connection between humankind and our natural surroundings through architecture. Graycliff sits atop a cliff right on the edge of Lake Erie, and Wright designed it so that the main house was transparent in order to frame the view of the horizon line at the lake and integrate the house and its surroundings. Here you can see through those windows that look onto the south terrace that the lake is visible. It's been described as a screen in the landscape. The cantilevering in this space is also incredibly important to the design. It was suggested in correspondence during the design process that survives that the overhang be eliminated and that the wall be brought straight down to the ground, to which Wright responded, quote, "Only a fool would think of doing such a thing." He proceeded to explain that this would destroy the carefully balanced proportions of the house and drastically change the relationship of the house to the surrounding landscape. And this is, of course, what the fathers accomplished when they enclosed the space for their chapel. They did consider building an entirely separate structure, but the cost was prohibitive, and their plan A of hosting Mass in the main living space was not tenable. So they made the decision to convert the south terrace into their chapel by filling in the sunken garden to extend the floor space, moving the interior doors to serve as windows on a new outer wall, and then enclosing it. They replaced the clear glass with colored glass in order to give the effect of stained glass. And this was the birth of what they called St. Michael's Chapel. It was a modest and intimate space of worship that could accommodate about 50 worshipers. This was a space that was the true heart of their community of faith, prayer being central. In October 1958, a 91-year-old Wright, just months before his death, visited Graycliff unannounced. The story is told that upon emerging from his car, he feverishly shook his cane at the house and yelled, "Who did this? Who made these changes? This is not my work." The fathers then explained their situation, to which Wright replied in resignation, "Well, I guess if you need it." When the Graycliff Conservancy took ownership of the property, their immediate goal was to remove all non-original additions, and the chapel was among the first to go, identified by the members of the Conservancy at the time as, quote, the single most important transformation of Graycliff in the ongoing attempt to recapture the essence of Wright's design. But we shouldn't fault the fathers for adulterating Wright's design to suit their needs. Instead, we should thank them for ensuring Graycliff's survival. They sensed the importance of preserving the site for historical, aesthetic, and spiritual reasons, and their chapel drew on the sacredness of the site, not aesthetically, but by tapping into an innate nature that was originally harnessed by Wright. The restoration effort began in 2000, and it was through the dedication of many volunteers that much of the preliminary work happened. For example, breaking up the concrete that had been poured by the fathers, as you saw in the last slide. Some of those slabs were over 15 inches thick. Here you can see the restored sunken garden that they recovered. On April 5th, 1999, the day that the Graycliff Conservancy took formal possession of Graycliff, there was a mass held in the chapel that those present compared to a funeral service, followed by a procession around the grounds, which included burning of incense to honor the time spent at Graycliff, as well as a blessing for all guests past, present, and those to come in the future. I like to think that blessing has lingered all these years later, as Graycliff to this day continues to be a very sacred place, thanks in part to the nurturing of the fathers that called it home. Thank you.
Thank you.